Maya Oren had a habit that her colleagues at the Stellar Mapping Division found quietly unsettling. She counted things that weren't there. Not in a broken way. Not in the way that made people whisper behind closed doors or file quiet reports with the wellness office. She was sharp, precise, and her work was spotless. But when she sat at her desk in the low hum of the mapping hall on Kepler Station, surrounded by 17 other cartographers who charted asteroid belts and cataloged hydrogen clouds, Maya would sometimes stop mid-calculation, tilt her head slightly to the left, and say, to no one in particular, something is missing from this picture. Her supervisor, a round-faced man named Gerald who had learned not to ask what she meant. Because 3 times in the last 4 years, Maya had said exactly that, and 3 times she had eventually found it. A rogue moon that wasn't on any map. A gravitational anomaly that suggested a collapsed structure of artificial origin. A repeating signal buried inside what everyone else had logged as stellar noise. She was 31 years old. She had never left the solar system. She had never fired a weapon. She had a small apartment with too many plants and a cat named Ptolemy who knocked her star charts off the shelf every single morning without remorse. And on a Tuesday, a perfectly unremarkable Tuesday in the 43rd year of the interstellar cooperative age, Maya Oren found the largest secret in human history. It started with a shadow. Not a metaphorical shadow. A literal one. A region of space, 11 light-years wide and positioned just beyond the Oort cloud's outer rim, that absorbed more light than the surrounding vacuum should allow. Most cartographers log these as data artifacts, calibration errors, the natural consequence of working with instruments that measure distances in numbers so large they made the human brain quietly give up and go home. Maya logged it too, at first. But she came back to it 6 weeks later while reviewing archived stellar surveys, and she noticed something that made her set down her coffee and not pick it up again for 3 hours. The shadow had edges. Not the soft, bleeding edges of a dust cloud or nebula. Sharp edges. Repeating geometric intervals. Edges that, when she overlaid 4 separate surveys taken across 11 years, had not moved, not drifted, not expanded, not behaved in any way that matched the physics of a natural phenomenon. She sat with this for a long time. Then she did something she had never done before in her professional career. She deleted her own report. She went home. She fed Ptolemy. She stood at her window and looked at the sky over the city. The gentle amber glow of a Portland evening, the familiar architecture of a civilization that had, by most measures, built itself into something worth being proud of. And she thought, if I'm reading this correctly, if those edges mean what I think they mean, then someone has been lying to everyone on this planet for a very long time. She went back to the office at 2 a.m. She started again. Slower this time. More careful. She pulled gravitational lensing data, cross-referenced thermal emission maps, dug through 17 years of deep space observatory logs that most people never touched because they were dry and technical and spectacularly boring to everyone except people like Maya, who found beauty in the architecture of numbers. By 6 a.m., when Gerald arrived with his coffee and his cheerful Tuesday energy, Maya was sitting very still at her desk with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes fixed on a single number on her screen. Gerald looked at her. "You okay?" "Gerald," she said quietly, "how many planets are in the solar system?" He blinked.
8.
"Same as always." "Right," said Maya.
8.
She turned her screen toward him. On it was a gravitational mass calculation. The number at the bottom, the total calculated mass of all detected bodies in the solar neighborhood, was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not rounding error wrong. It was wrong by the equivalent mass of 43 planets. Gerald's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "That's a calibration error," he said. "I've recalibrated 11 times," said Maya. "Then it's a data error. I pulled from 6 independent observatories on 3 continents and 2 orbital platforms." Gerald stared at the number. "Maya," he said carefully, "what are you suggesting?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Portland was waking up. A tram hummed past. A delivery drone blinked its way between buildings. The city was doing what cities did, breathing, moving, being entirely unaware. "I'm not suggesting anything yet," she said. "I'm just counting what's missing." She pulled up the shadow on the screen. Those perfect geometric edges. But I think, she said, that someone built something out there. Something very, very large. And they didn't want anyone to find it. She paused. And I think they're human. They came for her on a Thursday. Not dramatically. No black vehicles, no men in sunglasses, no cinematic sense of threat. Just a woman in a plain gray coat who was sitting in the mapping hall's small lobby when Maya arrived for work, reading a physical book, which was unusual enough that Maya noticed her immediately, because nobody read physical books in lobbies anymore unless they were performing patients. The woman looked up. She had a calm face. Not cold. Not warm either. The face of someone who had spent a long time training herself to give nothing away and had gotten very good at it. Maya Orange, she said. Not a question. Yes, said Maya, because lying seemed pointless. My name is Sarah Voss. I work for an office that doesn't have a public directory listing. She stood, tucking the book under her arm. We'd like to talk to you about your calculations from Tuesday morning. Maya thought about this. You deleted my report, she said. We intercepted it before it was filed, yes.
How?
We have monitoring protocols on certain search patterns. Yours triggered 4 of them simultaneously, which is actually a record. There was something in Sarah's voice that wasn't quite pride, but was adjacent to it. We've been watching that shadow for 22 years. In that time, 3 other people got close to what you found. None of them got there the way you did, through the mass calculation. What happened to the 3 others? Maya asked. Sarah tilted her head slightly. They were offered a conversation. Same as you. Did they take it?
2 did.
1 retired to a farm in Vermont and seems very happy. Maya looked at Sarah Voss for a long moment. Behind her, through the glass doors, she could see Gerald at his desk, frowning at something on his screen. Ordinary and unaware. Is this the part, Maya said, where you tell me the truth? This is the part where I take you somewhere the truth is kept, said Sarah. Whether I tell it to you depends on what you do next. They flew for 9 hours. Maya was not blindfolded. Sarah said this with a faint expression that suggested the idea was slightly insulting, but the aircraft's windows were opaqued, and her phone sat in a small metal tray that hummed quietly in a way that suggested it was being thoroughly emptied of the ability to communicate with anything. The facility was underground. That much was obvious from the elevator descent and the shift in air pressure. It was not a military installation in any aesthetic sense. It had the quiet, focused energy of a research institution, the kind of place where important work happened in ordinary-looking rooms by people in comfortable shoes. Sarah led her to a room with a table, 2 chairs, and a wall-sized screen currently showing a live feed of deep space. On the screen, in the dark between stars, there were shapes. Maya sat down slowly. The shapes were massive. That was the first thing. Not large in the way that spacecraft were large, or even in the way that space stations were large. These were planetary in scale, structures that occupied the visual field the way a moon occupies the visual field, except they were not natural. They had geometry, lines and angles, and the specific visual grammar of deliberate construction. There were many of them. Maya counted. She reached 30 before she stopped, because the scale was making her brain perform the quiet shutdown it performed when confronted with numbers too large to metabolize emotionally. How long? She asked. Sarah sat across from her. The program began 67 years ago. The first hull was completed 41 years ago. The most recent was finished 3 years ago. 67 years, Maya said. She stopped. That's before the Interstellar Cooperative. Before first contact. 11 years before, yes. Maya looked at her. So when we met the Vethani, when we joined the cooperative, we already had these. We had 12 at that point, said Sarah. And nobody, Maya turned back to the screen. Nobody in the cooperative knows.
No.
No alien civilization. No interstellar council. None of our diplomatic partners.
No.
Maya was quiet. The shapes on the screen hung in their silent formation, vast and patient and utterly invisible to every telescope and sensor array that wasn't specifically calibrated to find them. Why? She said. Not accusatorially. Genuinely. Sarah folded her hands on the table. Because, she said, 67 years ago, we looked at the universe and we understood something that took everyone else a much longer time to learn.
She paused.
The galaxy is not peaceful, Maya. The cooperative is an agreement between civilizations who are afraid of each other and have formalized that fear into diplomacy. The reason no one conquers anyone else is not kindness. It is calculation. It is the understanding that the cost of aggression is uncertain, and uncertainty is the only thing that keeps large predators from eating smaller ones. Maya stared at her. We were small, Sarah said simply. We were new. We were the youngest species at the table by 4,000 years, and every civilization in that cooperative had, at some point in their history, removed a younger species from the equation because the calculation favored it. She looked at the screen. So, we made the calculation change. By building these. Quietly.
Slowly.
In the dark, where no one was looking. Sarah's voice was even, but there was something underneath it. Not pride exactly. Something older and more complex. We didn't build them to conquer. We built them so that anyone who considered conquering us would run the numbers and find that the cost was incomprehensible. Maya looked at the shapes on the screen. 30-something planet-sized warships. Silent in the dark. Never fired. Never revealed. Has anyone ever come close, she asked, to actually moving against us? Sarah was quiet for a moment. Once, she said. The Vethani were the first. Every human child knew this. It was in every history curriculum, every cultural touchstone, every anniversary broadcast. The Vethani vessel had entered the solar system 56 years ago, a sleek and enormous thing that moved through space with the casual grace of a civilization that had been doing this for a very long time. They had transmitted greetings in 17 mathematical frameworks simultaneously, which the scientific community had decoded in 8 days, and the diplomatic community had spent the following 3 weeks arguing about the correct tone of the response. In the end, humanity had said hello. And the Vethani had said, in essence, good, we've been watching you, you are acceptable, here is the cooperative, here are the rules, welcome. It had felt, to most humans, like an honor. Maya had been 5 years old at the time. She remembered her mother lifting her up to see a screen, some public broadcast somewhere, a square of blue light in a busy street, the image of the Vethani vessel rendered in sharp detail. She remembered not fully understanding what she was looking at, but understanding that the adults around her were feeling something enormous. She had never questioned the benevolence of that moment. Sitting in the underground facility, looking at the screen, she was questioning it now.
The Vethani, she said.
Sarah nodded, slowly.
Tell me.
Sarah stood and walked to the screen. She brought up a new image, not the warships, but a data visualization. A timeline, dense with events, cross-referenced with communications logs and sensor readings and diplomatic transcripts. 14 years into the cooperative, Sarah said, a species called the Drevathi applied for membership. Small civilization, about 40 light-years from here. Technically capable, but culturally isolated. They'd been developing independently for about 2,000 years. I know who the Drevathi are, said Maya. They're cooperative members. They are now. Sarah highlighted a section of the timeline. At the time of their application, there was a 6-month window where their membership was under review. Standard process. During that window, they had no cooperative protections. She paused. During that same window, the Vethani moved 3 deep space fleets into the Drevathi system. Maya went still. The official reason logged with the cooperative was navigational repositioning, Sarah continued. A standard maintenance exercise. The cooperative council reviewed it and accepted the explanation. She looked at Maya. The Drevathi had no voice in the review. They hadn't been admitted yet. What happened? The Drevathi withdrew their application. The room was very quiet.
They withdrew it, Maya said.
After 3 Vethani fleets showed up in their system. Yes. And no one in the cooperative. The cooperative is largely Vethani adjacent in its structure, Sarah said. The founding framework was written by 4 civilizations, 3 of which have long-standing economic relationships with the Vethani. The 4th abstained from the review vote. She looked at the timeline. The Drevithi reapplied 8 years later, under different political leadership. They were admitted. They have been quiet members ever since. Maya thought about the Drevithi. She'd seen their cultural outputs in the cooperative's shared archive, art that was strangely subdued, architecture that minimized structural height, a recurring motif in their visual language that xenocultural analysts had described as introspective and harmonically resolving. A culture that had learned, at a crucial moment, to make itself small. "You think the Vethani were going to do the same to us," she said. "I think the Vethani did the math on us 3 separate times," Sarah said. "Once when they made first contact. Once when we were formally admitted to the cooperative. And once 11 years after admission, when we had a political crisis that temporarily destabilized our government and created what some external analysts might have described as an institutional vulnerability." "The partition crisis," Maya said quietly. It had been a bad decade. Political fracturing, resource disputes, for years of genuine instability. During the partition crisis, Sarah said, the Vethani quietly repositioned a fleet to within 18 light-years of Seoul. 18 light-years. Maya knew that distance the way she knew her own address. It was close. In interstellar terms, it was very close. "What stopped them?" she said. Sarah turned back to the screen. Back to the warships.
"We told them," she said.
Maya blinked. "You told them?" "Not publicly. Not through diplomatic channels. We sent a single transmission, encrypted in the Vethani's own secure military framework, which we had been quietly decoding for 9 years, directly to their fleet command." "What did the transmission say?" Sarah pulled up a text file on the screen. It was short. 3 sentences. Maya read it. She read it again. The first sentence identified the Vethani fleet by its precise coordinates and vessel registry numbers, the numbers that were classified at the highest level of Vethani military security that no outside civilization should have been able to know. The second sentence said, "We know what you did to the Drevithi." The third sentence said, "Look at grid reference 774 alpha and tell us the calculations still make sense." Grid reference 774 alpha was, Maya now knew, the location of the warship formation she was currently looking at on the screen.
"They looked," she said.
"They looked," said Sarah. "Their fleet turned around within 48 hours. They have never repositioned towards Seoul again." 14 years later, at a cooperative summit, the Vethani ambassador gave a speech about the importance of mutual respect and civilizational autonomy that was widely praised as visionary. Maya sat with this for a long, silent moment. Outside this room, above ground, above sky, in the cold space between stars, the galaxy was going about its business. Treaties were being signed. Cultural exchanges were being planned. The great, slow machinery of interstellar diplomacy was grinding forward with the appearance of order. And hidden in the dark, patient and silent, 30-something planet-sized ships waited. Not for war. For the moment when someone ran the numbers and decided war was the rational choice, and found, instead, that the calculation was impossible. "Does it work?" Maya asked. "Long term? You can't hide them forever." "No," said Sarah. "We can't." She sat back down. "Which is why I'm talking to you." "You want me to find the others," Maya said. Sarah looked at her carefully. "What others?" "The other civilizations doing the same thing." Maya's mind was already moving, the way it moved when a problem had shape to it, when the numbers started talking to each other. "We're not the only ones. We can't be. If the Vethani have been operating like this for however long they've been spacefaring, other civilizations will have run the same calculation we did. Build something terrible, hide it, use the threat of it as a shield." She looked at Sarah. "The galaxy isn't a diplomatic community. It's a room full of people pointing hidden weapons at each other and calling it peace." Sarah said nothing for a moment. Then, "We've confirmed 4 other civilizations with comparable programs. 2 others are suspected. The Vethani themselves, ironically, almost certainly have a hidden arsenal that makes ours look modest." "So everyone knows," said Maya. "On some level, everyone at the table knows that everyone else might have something hidden. It's the knowing that prevents the conflict." "Partially," said Sarah. "But it's unstable." Because knowing is not the same as certainty, and the calculation only holds as long as the uncertainty is frightening enough. If someone ever develops a sensor array capable of accurately mapping hidden arsenals across the galaxy, then the uncertainty collapses, Maya said. And whoever has the biggest verified arsenal wins the calculation. And everyone else becomes the Drevithi. Yes. Maya stood up. She needed to move. She always needed to move when a problem became this large. She walked to the screen and stood close to it, looking at the warships. They were beautiful, in a horrifying way. The scale of them was beyond ego. No single person, no single generation had built these. They were the product of 67 years of collective human will, sustained across political changes and economic shifts, and the grinding ordinary difficulty of keeping a secret that large for that long. Thousands of people had worked on this. Thousands of people had kept the silence. She thought about Gerald, his cheerful Tuesday energy, his complete and total ignorance. She thought about her mother, lifting her up to see the first Vethani broadcast. She thought about the Drevithi, their subdued art, their harmonically resolving motifs, the culture of a people who had learned to make themselves invisible and called it introspection. "What do you need from me?" she said. "We need the best cartographer we have," Sarah said, "to build a complete map of the galaxy's hidden arsenals. Not to expose them, not to use them as leverage, but because we are approaching a moment, within the next 20 to 30 years, where sensor technology across multiple civilizations will advance to the point where all of this becomes visible anyway." She stood up and came to stand beside Maya. "When that happens," Sarah said quietly, "we want to already be in the room with every civilization that has a hidden program, having a conversation we've been preparing for decades. A conversation about what to do when the uncertainty disappears. About whether there's a world in which all of this," she gestured at the screen, "gets dismantled together, or whether the race to be the biggest verified arsenal tears the cooperative apart." Maya stared at the shapes on the screen. "You're not trying to win the arms race," she said.
No.
"You're trying to end it. We're trying to create the conditions for ending it, before someone else ends the conversation permanently." Maya was quiet for a long time. Ptolemy was going to knock her star charts off the shelf tomorrow morning, and she wasn't going to be there to be irritated about it. "I need full access to every observatory dataset we have," she said finally, "including military-grade sensor arrays. And I need the specific calibration signatures your team used to detect the other 4 confirmed programs." "Done," said Sarah. "And I need Gerald," Maya said. Sarah blinked. "Your supervisor?" "He's not just my supervisor. He's the only other person I've ever met who counts things that aren't there." Maya glanced at her. "You said I triggered 4 monitoring protocols. What were the other 3? Sarah looked at her carefully. "Gerald who?" she said slowly. "Triggered 2 of them. Last year. He didn't get as far as you did." "He got further than you think," Maya said. "He just stopped because he trusted the calibration." She looked back at the screen. "He shouldn't have trusted the calibration. I'll tell him that." She reached out and touched the edge of the screen, where one of the vast dark shapes hung in its silent formation. 43 missing planets of mass, built by human hands, over human lifetimes, for the very human reason that fear and love are sometimes indistinguishable when they're aimed at the same thing. "Okay," said Maya Oren. "Let's make a map." They gave her 3 days to settle affairs before she disappeared into the program. She spent the first evening at home, which meant sitting on her kitchen floor with Ptolemy in her lap, doing the specific kind of thinking that required the weight of a cat and the absence of screens. Ptolemy had the dignified indifference of a creature who had lived his entire life being slightly more perceptive than his environment and had stopped being surprised by this. She stroked his ears and thought about scale. This was the thing she kept returning to, not the politics, not the ethics, not even the extraordinary revelation that humanity had been quietly building the most powerful weapons in the known galaxy for 6 decades. It was the scale, the conceptual problem of it. How do you hold something that large in your head without distorting it? The warships were planet-sized. Not metaphorically. They were, by some measurements, larger than certain planets, the smaller, colder ones at the outer edge of solar systems, the ones that barely qualified for the classification. And there were 31 of them. She'd gotten the exact count now. 31 objects of planetary mass, shaped by human engineering, drifting in deep space in a formation so spread out that, even knowing where to look, they were nearly invisible. The engineering alone was a kind of impossibility. Not a real one, clearly, since they existed, but a conceptual impossibility, the kind that made you revise your understanding of what a civilization was capable of when it was frightened enough and focused enough and willing to keep a secret badly enough. 67 years. Her parents had not been born when the program began. Their parents had. Someone's grandparents had looked at the universe, made a calculation, and begun building something they knew they would never finish, for a purpose they hoped would never be used. There was something in that she found almost unbearably human. She thought about the Vethani. She'd always found them, in cultural terms, slightly difficult. They were aesthetically refined. Their art and music were genuinely beautiful, but there was a quality in their diplomatic interactions that she had always subconsciously registered as management. A quality of controlling the frame, of making sure that every conversation happened on their terms, in their language, within their framework of understanding. She had assumed this was a cultural trait. A civilization that had been spacefaring for 12,000 years simply had more practice at the art of interstellar interaction. Of course they were smoother. Of course they knew where to stand and when to speak. Now she saw it differently. It wasn't sophistication. It was the habituated behavior of a species that had long ago decided that control was safety. That the only way to be sure you weren't the Drevathi was to always be the one choosing the frame. We did the same thing, she thought. We just did it in the dark. Ptolemy shifted in her lap, redistributing his weight with the serene confidence of someone who owned the floor. What would you do, she asked him, if you found out the other cats in the neighborhood had hidden weapons? He looked at her with amber eyes that contained, as always, the specific wisdom of an animal who had decided that questions were for other people.
Right, she said.
You'd make a map. On the second day, she called her mother, not to tell her anything.
Just to talk.
Her mother lived in Tucson and had spent 40 years as a civil engineer, building bridges and water systems in places that needed them, and she had the quality of someone who understood deeply that the most important things were usually structural, usually invisible, and usually built by people who expected no recognition for them. They talked about small things. The garden, a cousin's new job, the quality of light in the evenings lately. Before she hung up, Maya said, "Mom, do you remember holding me up to see the Vethani broadcast? When I was little?" Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Of course. You were so small. I wanted you to see it. I thought she needs to remember this. This is the most important thing that's ever happened." "Were you scared?" Another pause. "Yes," her mother said, with the simplicity of someone who had never thought to be anything other than honest. "I was terrified. But, I remember thinking it's okay to be scared. The important thing is what you do with your hands while you're scared." Maya sat with that for a long time after she hung up. The important thing is what you do with your hands while you're scared. 67 years of frightened, focused, extraordinary hands. She packed a bag. She went back to the facility. Gerald took it better than Sarah expected, and roughly as well as Maya had predicted. He sat in the same room with the same table for a long time, looking at the screen with the expression of a man who was reorganizing every assumption he had made about reality into a new configuration that was going to take a while to settle. Then he said, "The mass calculation." "Yes," said Maya. "I ran that calculation 14 months ago. I got the same discrepancy you got. I thought I'd made an error." "I know. You went back and recalibrated." "Twice," he said. "The second time I found a minor sensor drift in the primary array and corrected for it, and the discrepancy got smaller, and I thought he stopped. I thought I'd fixed it." "The sensor drift was real," Maya said. "Correcting for it was right. But it only accounted for 11% of the discrepancy. You stopped looking when the number got smaller." Gerald was quiet. "I stopped looking," he agreed, "because I wanted it to be a calibration error." He looked at her. "Is that?" "Yes," she said. "That's how this has stayed hidden, not just through technical concealment, through the deep human desire for the numbers to make sense." He looked at the screen, at the shapes. Okay, he said eventually. What do we do? They began building the map. It was, in purely technical terms, the most complex cartographic project in human history. They weren't mapping locations, they had some of those, or suspected locations for the 4 confirmed other programs. They were mapping methods. The specific ways a civilization would conceal a massive object in deep space, the signatures those methods left at various sensor frequencies, the particular geometries of gravitational influence that couldn't be fully hidden no matter how good the technology was. Because that was the insight at the core of Maya's method, the thing she had learned from counting things that weren't there. You can hide almost anything, but you cannot hide the absence of what would have been there if you weren't hiding it. Gravity doesn't lie. Mass doesn't disappear. If you build something the size of a planet, the universe keeps score, and the score shows up in the behavior of light, and the drift of nearby bodies, and the very specific shape of the silence around a region of space that should have something in it, and doesn't. She called this reading the negative space. Gerald called it, more prosaically, the missing mass problem, and he was the one who developed the actual algorithmic framework, a beautiful piece of work that Maya felt genuinely proud of, in the way she felt proud of elegant solutions even when she hadn't written them herself. They worked for 4 months. They slept in the facility, ate in the facility, argued constantly about methodology and approach in the way of 2 people who respected each other enough to be completely honest. Sarah came and went. She brought updates from above, from the political and diplomatic levels of the program, the long strategic conversation about what happened next. There were meetings happening, Maya gathered. Very quiet meetings. The kind that happened without agendas or records, between people who had spent their careers learning how to have important conversations that left no trace. Maya stayed focused on the map. The map grew. 4 confirmed programs became 6. 6 became 9. One of the detections was tentative. The signature was ambiguous, could have been a natural phenomenon, but Maya had learned to trust her instinct about the difference between the absence created by nature and the absence created by intention. 9 civilizations, plus humanity. 10 civilizations in the cooperative, out of 63 total members, that had looked at the universe's unspoken rules and made the same calculation. We're not exceptional, Gerald said one evening, looking at the map. We didn't have a unique insight. We just did it first among the newer members, Maya said. The older civilizations, the ones who've been spacefaring for 10,000–15,000 years, they figured this out long before us. They've had programs for centuries. She pointed to a cluster in the map's outer region. These 3, the Orhane, the Sivith, the cooperative's founding members, their programs are so old and so well developed that by now they probably don't think of them as secret arsenals anymore. They're just infrastructure. The background assumption of safety. Like a lock on a door, Gerald said. Like a lock that's been there so long, everyone forgets it was installed and just thinks of it as the door. He was quiet, looking at the map. The newer members, the ones like us who built programs in response to feeling vulnerable, they're the unstable factor, aren't they? The older civilizations have had time to reach equilibrium. They know each other's programs. There's an unspoken acknowledgement. Yes, said Maya. We're outside that acknowledgement. We built something they don't know about, don't account for, and when they find out, it disrupts the equilibrium. It could. She studied the map. Unless we're the ones who tell them. Gerald looked at her. That's what this is, he said slowly. That's why we're building the map. Not for ourselves. We're building the evidence package that lets humanity walk into a room with the Orhane and the Sivith and the Vethani and say, we know about yours, here's what we know about ours. Now let's have the conversation that replaces all of this with something better. Maya didn't answer. She didn't need to. The map glowed between them, patient and complete, charting the hidden architecture of the galaxy's terrified peace. Sarah took them to meet the program's founder. This was not what Maya expected. She had assumed, in some vague way, that the person who had initiated a 67-year planetary construction program would be either long dead or inaccessible behind layers of institutional hierarchy. Instead, Sarah drove them to a quiet residential neighborhood in the outskirts of Lisbon and parked in front of a house with an overgrown garden. The woman who opened the door was 91 years old and moved with the careful precision of someone who had fully accepted the terms of her body's current contract with her. She was small and white-haired, and had eyes that were an extraordinary pale gray, the color of deep space imagery before enhancement. Her name was Dara Mossad. She had been, 67 years ago, a 24-year-old astrophysicist at an international research collective, working on long-range sensor development. "I know who you are," she said to Maya, stepping back to let them in. "Sarah tells me you found us through the mass calculation." "Yes," said Maya. Dara made a sound that might have been approval. "I thought about that vector for years. I kept expecting someone to walk through the door because of it. I'm glad it was you." The house was full of books and plants and the organized accumulation of a very long life. They sat in a room that looked out onto the overgrown garden, and Dara poured tea with the unhurried manner of someone who had long since stopped being in a hurry about anything. "Ask what you want to ask," she said to Maya. "Why didn't you stop?" Maya said, "When you had the first 12 ships, when you'd stopped the Vethani, why did you keep building?" Dara was quiet for a moment. She looked at the garden. "Because 12 was enough to stop the Vethani," she said. "And then I looked at the Sivith, and 12 was not enough. And then I looked at the full picture, and I understood that there was no number that was enough in the framework we were operating in." She turned her gray eyes to Maya. "That's the trap of deterrence. The logic of it demands infinity. You can never have enough because enough is defined by what the other side might have, and you don't know what the other side has. So, why keep building at all? Because the alternative, in that moment, for a young species in a universe that had just revealed its actual rules, was to be the Drevithi." Her voice was level and, without self-pity. "I was 24 years old. I had just understood what the cooperative was and what we were to it. I made a choice that I have spent 67 years not regretting and also not being at peace with." She looked at her tea. The ships were never the point. They were a bridge. A bridge over the gap between being prey and being a participant. What I always wanted, what I designed the program toward, eventually, when I understood enough to design toward something, was the moment when we had enough credibility, enough security, enough standing to be in the room where the real conversation happened. She looked at Maya. "That conversation cannot happen between the afraid and the powerful. The afraid don't have standing. They get managed. We had to stop being afraid first, not by solving the problem, but by becoming the kind of entity the problem couldn't simply erase." "And now," Maya said. "Now," said Dara, "you and your colleague have built the evidence. And now we are, for the first time, able to have the actual conversation." She glanced at Sarah. "How is the timeline looking?" "Diplomatic groundwork in place with 2 of the 3 founding cooperative members," Sarah said. "We expect to request the closed session within 18 months. Dara nodded. She looked back at Maya. "You won't be in the room for that conversation." "I know," said Maya. "Does that bother you?" Maya thought about it honestly. "A little," she said. "But I think I built my part. I think that's what the work was." Dara looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something that Maya thought about for years afterward. "The most important structures," she said, "are always the ones nobody sees. The foundations, the load-bearing walls, the calculations that make the architecture possible." She looked at her hands, the hands of a 91-year-old woman who had, at 24, decided to build something no one would ever be allowed to know about. "You have those hands. The kind that can hold something that large and still count clearly." She picked up her tea. "Don't stop counting," she said. 3 weeks before the closed session was scheduled, something unexpected happened. Maya was deep in a secondary analysis, cross-referencing the concealment signatures of the oldest cooperative members' programs to build a timeline of when each civilization had made the decision, when Sarah came into the workroom with a look on her face that Maya had learned to recognize. Not alarm. Something more complex than alarm. The face of someone who had just received information that required them to revise a long-held model. "The Vethani ambassador has requested a meeting," Sarah said. "Outside official channels. With the head of our program." "They know," Gerald said from across the room. He didn't look up from his screen. "Apparently," Sarah said. "For how long?" Maya asked. "Unknown. The request doesn't specify. But," Sarah pulled up a transmission log. "The phrasing they used for the meeting request includes a reference to the closed session that we have not publicly announced through any channel." Which means they've had someone inside the planning process for at least 6 months, Maya said. Possibly longer. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Gerald said, still not looking up. Or, they built the same map we built. Maya turned to look at him. He was very calm, the way he got when a problem resolved into clarity. Think about it. They're a 12,000-year-old spacefaring civilization. The missing mass problem isn't unique to us. They have better sensors than we do, longer observation windows, more data. They've known about our program almost certainly longer than we think. They've chosen not to act on it. Why? Sarah asked. Gerald finally looked up. Because they ran the calculation, he said simply. They saw what we built. They assessed the cost of conflict. They made the decision the program was designed to make them make. And then he paused. And then they kept watching. And eventually they saw us building the map. Maya went very still. They saw us mapping their program, she said.
Yes.
And instead of treating that as a hostile act, they requested a meeting, she said softly. The room was very, very quiet. They want to be in a room, Maya said. Before the closed session. They want to walk in as participants, not subjects. They've always wanted.
She stopped.
Something was restructuring itself in her understanding. The Vethani fleet's repositioning towards Seoul during the partition crisis. The speech about civilizational autonomy 14 years later, widely praised as visionary. The 3,000 years of cooperative management, the controlling of frames, the smooth and ever-present work of keeping every conversation within their preferred architecture. They've been trying to have this conversation for a long time, she said slowly. On their terms. In their framework. The Drevathi incident wasn't predation. Or, it wasn't only predation. It was a test. They were testing whether a young civilization, under pressure, would capitulate or adapt. That's a generous interpretation, Sarah said carefully. Maybe, Maya said. Or maybe a civilization that's been managing interstellar relations for 12,000 years has developed methods that look like predation to younger eyes because younger eyes don't have the context. She paused. I'm not saying they're good. I'm saying they're complicated, and we've been reading them as simply powerful when they might be terrified too. In their own ancient, architecturally perfect way. She thought about what Dara had said. The conversation cannot happen between the afraid and the powerful. The afraid don't have standing. We have standing now, she said. Because of the ships. Because of the map. For the first time, we're not younger eyes asking for context. We're peers who built our own architecture and figured out theirs. Sarah looked at her. Should we take the meeting? Maya didn't hesitate. Yes, she said. But not with the program head. With me. The Vethani ambassador's name, rendered in its closest phonetic human approximation, was Ethan Vrel. He was, by Vethani standards, relatively young, perhaps 400 years old, which placed him in what xenocultural analysts described as the Vethani equivalent of early middle age. He was tall. They were all tall. The Vethani physiognomy involved a skeletal structure that distributed mass differently than human bone, creating a silhouette that was both familiar and uncanny. Something in the proportions of the limbs, the placement of the shoulder joints, the specific angle at which the head sat on the neck. Not wrong. Just other, in a way that required active recalibration of the subconscious pattern recognition that human brains performed constantly. His eyes were amber yellow, with pupils that oriented horizontally, and they had the quality of someone who was genuinely paying attention, not performing attention, not managing the experience of this meeting from behind careful neutrality, but actually interested. They met in a neutral location. A small research station in low Earth orbit, staffed with a skeleton crew who had been quietly relocated to the far end of the station for the afternoon. The meeting room had a wide viewport, and the Earth hung below it in its blue-white familiarity, and Ethan Vrel stood at the viewport for a moment before sitting down, looking at it with an expression that Maya couldn't read. Your world is very young, he said. In their shared language, the cooperative standard, which was originally built on Vethani linguistic architecture. Everything built on Vethani linguistic architecture, Maya thought, and felt the weight of that. Yes, she said. He sat. His movements had a deliberateness that she was choosing to read as respect rather than calculation. You built the map, he said. My colleague and I, yes. It is accurate. He said this simply, without surprise. Our analysts reviewed your methodology. The negative space detection approach is we have not seen it formalized that way before. We have used intuitive versions of it for a long time, but your colleague's algorithmic framework is... He paused, and something in his expression shifted. It is elegant. Maya looked at him. You wanted to have this conversation, she said. You've wanted it for a long time. Ethan Vrel was quiet for a moment. His horizontal pupils were oriented toward the viewport, toward the earth below. There is a concept in our culture, he said, that does not translate precisely into cooperative standard. The closest approximation is, the word we use refers to a specific kind of burden. The burden carried by the one who knows the danger and cannot share the knowledge without creating a different danger. You knew about the arms race, Maya said. The hidden arsenals. You've known about them across multiple civilizations for a long time. For approximately 6,000 years, he said. Since we discovered the remnants of a civilization that destroyed itself in exactly the way you have been trying to prevent. The room was very quiet. A civilization that had the same architecture, Maya said. The arms race. The hidden programs. The equilibrium of mutual uncertainty.
Yes.
And a sensor technology development that collapsed the uncertainty. And then he turned from the viewport. And then nothing. Nothing left but the remnants, spread across 4 star systems. A civilization that had been, by all our analysis, approximately as sophisticated and capable as ours was at the time. He looked at her directly. We have been trying to prevent the recurrence of that event for 6,000 years, he said. Every action the Vethani have taken in the formation and management of the cooperative, every piece of the framework architecture, has been oriented toward that prevention. With, I acknowledge, imperfect judgment. With methods that have caused harm to smaller civilizations who did not understand our reasons. The Drevathi, Maya said. Something in his face that she was now reading as grief. Yes, he said. Among others. We have been sometimes wrong in our methods. We learned the purpose before we learned the wisdom. That is a very human formulation, actually. Your xenocultural analysts use it frequently. I have always found it precise. Maya sat with this for a long moment. She thought about Dara Mossad at 24, looking at the universe and making a calculation. She thought about the 31 ships in the dark, built by frightened, loving human hands over 6 decades. She thought about the Drevathi's subdued art and their harmonically resolving motifs. She thought about a dead civilization spread across 4 star systems, whose only legacy was the lesson it had left for the people who found the ruins. You could have told us, she said finally. When we first joined the cooperative, you could have told us what you knew. We could have, Ethan Vrel said. We chose not to, and that was a mistake, and I am not in this room to defend it. He leaned forward slightly. I am in this room because you have done something that we have spent 6,000 years hoping a younger civilization would do. What's that? You built the deterrent, he said, and then you started building the alternative. He looked at the map she had placed on the table between them, a printed version, physical, which felt right for this kind of conversation. You didn't just count the weapons, he said quietly. You counted what the weapons were for. And then you asked what else could do the same thing. Maya looked at the map. At the 10 marked locations. At the 3 suspected ones. At the vast and frightened and secret architecture of the galaxy's long peace. The closed session, she said. What do you want from it? The same thing you want from it, he said. A room in which everyone admits what they have and agrees on what it means. A framework that replaces the deterrent with something that doesn't require the uncertainty. He paused. The technology to collapse the uncertainty is, by our estimates, 30 to 40 years away. Perhaps less. When it arrives, the calculation breaks. Every hidden program becomes visible. Every civilization's true military weight becomes known. And whoever has the most is suddenly the Vethani, Maya said. And everyone else is the Drevathi.
Yes.
Unless the frame changes before the technology arrives, she said. Unless the conversation has already happened. Unless the arsenals are already being discussed, disclosed, and addressed, he said, collectively, in a framework built for that purpose. Maya looked at him, at his ancient amber eyes and his careful, burdened face, and the 6,000 years of trying behind everything he said. "You need us at the table," she said, "not just as participants, as the ones who map the agenda, because you've been trying to have this conversation from inside the Vethani framework for centuries, and every other civilization reads that as management, as controlling the frame." "Yes," he said simply, "but if it comes from us, from a young civilization that built its own deterrent and its own map and then voluntarily chose the conversation over the arsenal, it changes what the conversation is possible of," he said. "Yes." Maya looked out the viewport at the earth below. Portland was somewhere in that sweep of coastline, small and ordinary and completely unaware. "Okay," she said. "Tell me what you need me to map." The closed session took place on a station that had been built specifically for it, in a region of space equidistant from the 7 participating civilizations' home systems. It had taken 2 years to construct. It was, by any aesthetic measure, beautiful, the kind of architecture that occurs when 7 different design traditions collaborate without trying to dominate the result, each contributing something that was distinctly theirs, the whole creating something that belonged to no one tradition, and therefore felt strangely like it belonged to all of them. Maya was not in the room. She had known she wouldn't be, and she had made her peace with it in the way she made peace with most things, by understanding the structure of it clearly. She was a cartographer. She had made the map. The people in the room were the ones who would decide what the territory meant. She watched the proceedings through a secure feed in a small monitoring room 2 decks below the main chamber, with Gerald on one side of her and Sarah on the other, and a very surprising number of snacks that Sarah had apparently organized because she had correctly predicted that they would all need something to do with their hands. There were 7 civilizations represented. 3 of the cooperative's founders, 2 mid-range members including humanity, the Vethani, and, in a development that had surprised everyone except Maya, the Drevathi, who had been invited by Ethon Vrel himself, in a gesture of acknowledgement that had no diplomatic precedent and that the Drevathi delegation had accepted after 11 days of deliberation with what Maya privately understood to be the particular silence of a people who had been waiting 400 years to be asked. The session lasted 9 days. Maya watched all of it. She watched the disclosure process, each civilization presenting the existence and general parameters of their program, for the first time, to the others in the room. She watched the Vethani's ancient face and the Orhane's complex 6-limbed body language and the human delegation's carefully composed expressions. She watched the Drevathi representatives who were small and still, and who listened with the focused attention of people for whom this moment had a weight that no one else in the room could fully measure. She watched the moment. On the 6th day, when the representative of the Sivith, who were the oldest spacefaring civilization at the table at over 15,000 years, made a formal acknowledgement of responsibility for the conditions that had created the arms race architecture in the first place. The language was precise and impersonal in the Sivith way, but the content was unambiguous. Maya watched this and felt something complicated that took her a while to identify as the particular grief of a problem that had existed for so long it had been mistaken for the shape of reality itself. On the 9th day, they reached an agreement.
It was not a disarmament treaty.
Maya had not expected one that was too much, too fast, built on a foundation that needed more time to cure. What it was, instead, was a framework. An agreement to formally acknowledge the existence of all hidden programs, to establish a joint monitoring body with access to the negative space detection methodology, and to begin a structured, decades-long process of managed disclosure and collective security architecture development. The specific framing, the language that made it possible for 7 civilizations with 7 different histories and 7 different architectures of fear to sign onto the same document, had been written, quietly, largely by Maya and Gerald. They had spent 6 months on the language,
Getting the structure right.
finding the formulation that was true for all of them simultaneously without requiring any of them to abandon the terms through which they understood themselves. It was, Maya thought, the best work she had ever done. Not the ships, not the map even. This, the architecture of a sentence that 7 different civilizations could stand inside without feeling displaced. Gerald read the final text over her shoulder when it was signed, the signatures coming through the secure feed one by one. "You know what this is, right?" he said quietly. "What?" "The final weapon." He gestured at the screen, at the text, at the 7 signatures accumulating at the bottom. Not the ships. Not the deterrent. This. The thing that makes the deterrent unnecessary. He looked at her. That's what the whole program was always pointing toward. 67 years of building something terrifying so that eventually you could build something like this. Maya looked at the text, at the careful, structurally sound architecture of the language, at the 7 signatures. She thought about Dara Mossad at 24, about the hands that had started something in the dark, aimed at a future they could only partly see. The most important structures, she said softly, are always the ones nobody sees. Gerald nodded. He reached over and took a snack from Sarah's pile without looking at it. "Go home," he said. "Your cat needs feeding." Maya went home. Portland was exactly as she had left it. The trams hummed. The delivery drones blinked. The city breathed in its ordinary way, entirely unaware of what had been agreed 2 decks below the surface of a station in the precise geometric center of known civilized space. Ptolemy was at the door when she arrived. He performed the ritual of complete indifference followed by immediate and total demand for attention that was his standard welcome, and she sat on the kitchen floor with him in her lap and did nothing for a long time. She got her job back. Different parameters. She was now, technically, attached to a program that still had no public directory listing, and her work was still classified at a level that meant she could not discuss it at dinner parties, not that she had many dinner parties. But the work itself was different now. Lighter. Not lighter in scope. The scope was, if anything, larger than before. But lighter in the way that work is lighter when it is oriented toward building rather than concealment. She built detection infrastructure. She trained other cartographers in the negative space methodology. She was careful about this, careful to teach the principle without making it a formula, because the principle was what mattered. The specific insight that the absence of something is itself a shape, and shapes can be read. You can hide almost anything, but you cannot hide the fact that you are hiding. Gerald ran the algorithmic side of things. He was good at it in a way that she found genuinely moving, not because it was impressive but because he was so clearly happy. He had the quality, increasingly, of a man who had found the problem sized exactly right for him and was spending his days in the particular contentment of doing difficult work that mattered. Sarah moved on to other things. She came back occasionally, always unannounced, always with a book under her arm, always with the look of someone who is performing patience while waiting for the world to catch up with what she already knew. Dara Mossad died on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate. Maya heard about it through Sarah, third hand, a week after it happened. There was no public record. There was no obituary. There was a small mention in an internal document that Maya read once and did not need to read again. She went to Lisbon. She stood outside the house with the overgrown garden. She did not go in. She just stood there for a while, in the street, in the ordinary afternoon, thinking about the kind of person who could carry something for 67 years without being crushed by it. She walked back to the train station. On the way, she passed a school, and through a fence she could see children on a playing field, running with a specific abandon of people who had no idea what the universe was actually like and were perfectly right not to. She thought, by the time they're grown up, maybe the universe will actually be what it looks like to them. Maybe the thing we are building will be real by then. She thought, probably not entirely. These things take time.
But more than it is now.
More than it was when I was their age. That felt like enough. That felt, actually, like the thing she had been working toward all along, through all the calculations and the missing masses and the reading of shadows. Not a completed world. Just one that was fractionally, structurally, in a way that nobody could see but that would hold weight, more true than before. She counted the children on the playing field. 17. She smiled at no one in particular. She went home to feed her cat. 10 years after the closed session, the joint monitoring body published its first public report. Not all of it was public. The specific parameters of each civilization's program, the precise locations, the technical specifications, those remained classified at a level that would probably not be released in any of their lifetimes. But the framework itself, the fact of the conversation, the structure of what had been agreed, this was disclosed, carefully and in full consultation with all 7 signatories, in a document that was transmitted simultaneously to every cooperative member. Maya read it at her desk in the mapping hall, where she still worked, among cartographers who still mostly didn't know what she did on the days she was somewhere else. Gerald was at his desk across the room. He read it at the same time. When he finished, he looked up and caught her eye across the space between them, and they did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the moment didn't already contain. The report described, in carefully measured language, that the cooperative had established a new security architecture commission, that this commission had been engaged in confidential but multilateral discussions about deep space military programs, and that an agreement had been reached regarding mutual disclosure protocols and joint monitoring infrastructure. It did not describe the ships. It did not describe the map. It did not describe a meeting on an orbital station, or an old woman in a Lisbon garden, or a 91-year-old's hands, or the ruins of a civilization spread across 4 star systems 6,000 years ago. But it described the shape of what those things had made possible. Maya read it twice. Then she set it down and looked out the window at Portland, which was having a perfectly ordinary morning. Her phone buzzed. A message from a number she didn't recognize, which resolved, when she checked the routing, to an encrypted channel originating from, she checked the coordinates, the Drevithi home system. The message was short. It had no sender identified. It was just text in cooperative standard, clean and simple. It said, "We read the report. We counted what was missing before, and we can see its shape now. Thank you for building the negative space into something that holds weight." Maya sat with that for a long time. Then she wrote back, "We learned to count the missing things from you, or from what you became, which taught us why the missing things matter. That is the only honest accounting I have." She pressed send. Across the room, Gerald was already working. His hands moved across the screen with the focused, unhurried confidence of someone who had found his right size of problem. The mapping hall hummed around them. Outside, the city went about its business. Somewhere in the dark beyond the Oort cloud, 31 planet-sized ships drifted in their silent formation. Still patient. Still invisible to anyone not looking for the right kind of absence. But the conversations they had made possible were real. And the conversations, Maya thought the conversations were the point, had always been the point. The ships were the silence that the conversations needed around them. The negative space that gave the words their shape. You build the terrible thing so that the true thing becomes possible. You count the missing mass until you understand what was removed. You read the shadow until you can see the shape of the light. She pulled up her current project, a new detection analysis, a suspected program in a region they hadn't fully mapped yet. The numbers were interesting. There was a particular gravitational anomaly that was either a dense nebular remnant or something else entirely, and the something else entirely had, if she was reading it correctly, edges. She tilted her head slightly to the left. Something is missing from this picture, she thought, and began to count. And